Arcadia Valley, Missouri, a place where time seemed to idle, unhurried and unspoiled. Nestled among the rolling hills and the rocky spine of the St. Francois Mountains, the valley was a tapestry of wildflower meadows, ancient boulders, and winding rivers. The mornings smelled of dew-kissed earth and wood smoke, and the evenings glowed with golden skies that dipped behind the distant ridges. In a small white farmhouse just outside of Ironton, Fred and Martha Dawson had lived for over 50 years. Their home sat on a patch of land bordered by towering oak trees, with a garden full of marigolds and mint, and a swing on the front porch that faced the rising sun. They'd watched 5 decades of seasons change together from that swing. 5 decades of laughter, quiet conversations, and the comfort of a hand held in silence. Fred Dawson had the kind of face that made strangers smile. A square jaw softened by smile lines, thick gray brows, and warm hazel eyes that still held the spark of mischief even into his 70s. His white hair was always neatly combed, and he wore flannel shirts year-round, regardless of weather. Fred had worked his whole life at the local grocery store, eventually becoming its manager and a beloved figure around town. People remembered his easy charm and how he always helped carry groceries to the car for elderly customers. Martha, on the other hand, was the picture of gentle grace. Petite and soft-spoken, she had long white hair she kept tied in a ribbon and eyes like faded blue china. Her hands, though worn from years of homemaking and gardening, still moved with a quiet elegance. Martha had been a homemaker from the day she married Fred, tending to their house, raising their children, and nurturing her flower beds and trinket collection with tender devotion. Every Saturday, she browsed the flea markets around Ironton and Pilot Knob, always on the lookout for delicate porcelain animals or weathered picture frames. They'd raised 2 children, Michael and Ellie. Michael, the older of the 2, was broad-shouldered and steady, with steel-gray eyes and a calming presence. He lived in Kansas City with his wife and 2 grown sons, working as an architect. Ellie, their daughter, inherited Martha's delicate features and her love of music. She taught at a private school in North Carolina and had 2 daughters of her own. Though busy with lives of their own, both children visited when they could, their hearts tethered to the little white farmhouse in the valley. Fred and Martha's days were peaceful, filled with routines that had grown into rituals. Coffee on the porch swing, gardening side by side, slow dances in the kitchen to old country records. Especially Waylon Jennings, Fred's favorite. They hiked the trails at Elephant Rock State Park and waded barefoot through the cool waters at Johnson's Shut-Ins, where the ancient granite boulders stood like sleepy sentinels. Sometimes they would drive to Silver Mine State Park, just outside Fredericktown. There, they'd sit beneath the whispering sycamores, watching the Black River tumble over stone and sunlight dapple the forest floor. Fred would bring his harmonica and play a tune while Martha sketched wildflowers in her little notepad. Their love was a quiet, enduring thing. It didn't shout. It didn't demand attention. It was the kind of love that bloomed slowly and rooted deep, like the wild honeysuckle that grew along their fence line. It was present in every soft glance, every shared laugh, every comfort offered without words. They never grew tired of each other. Fred still kissed Martha's hand before dinner. Martha still brushed lint from Fred's collar with a mothering touch. And when they held each other, on the porch swing, in bed at night, on the trails winding through Missouri's wild beauty, it felt like the world stood still for just a moment. This was the life they built. And in that quiet corner of Arcadia Valley, it seemed as though it might go on forever. But time, even in the slow hills of Missouri, is always moving. The rooster's call echoed faintly through the crisp morning air, blending with the rustle of wind in the oak trees. Light filtered through the lace curtains of the kitchen, landing softly on the old pine table where Fred Dawson sat sipping his black coffee. He wore his favorite navy flannel shirt, well-worn and fraying at the collar, and a pair of suspenders stretched over his shoulders. The morning paper was folded neatly in front of him, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his hazel eyes scanning the headlines. From the stove, the scent of sizzling bacon wafted through the air. Martha moved gracefully, her white hair pinned up in a tidy bun, her apron tied over a soft lavender house dress. She hummed as she flipped the bacon and stirred the grits, pausing only to glance at Fred and smile. "Did you dream last night?" she asked casually, placing 2 eggs onto his plate with a practiced hand. Fred looked up and chuckled. "Not that I recall, though I reckon I had a dream I was dancin' with Waylon Jennings again." Martha laughed softly, her blue eyes twinkling. "You and that old record player." Fred grinned. "A man's gotta have his classics." After breakfast, they stepped onto the front porch, mugs in hand. The valley below was still wrapped in morning mist, dew glittering on the grass like tiny jewels. Birds chattered from the trees, and the smell of honeysuckle drifted on the breeze. They sat together on the porch swing, shoulders touching, sipping coffee in companionable silence. Beyond their front yard, the land rolled into the distance, patches of forest, open fields, and the faint shimmer of a creek winding through the meadow. "It's going to be a warm one today," Fred said, stretching his legs out. "Good day for a walk at Johnson's Shut-ins," Martha replied. "We could take a picnic." Fred nodded. "Sounds just right." Later that morning, they packed a small lunch, cold fried chicken, biscuits, and sweet tea, and drove the familiar back roads through Ironton past crumbling barns and old stone fences. The road narrowed as they approached the park, and the sound of rushing water grew louder with every turn. Johnson's Shut-ins was alive with sound and movement, water cascading over smooth granite, children laughing, birds calling overhead. Fred offered Martha his hand as they stepped carefully from rock to rock, making their way to a quiet spot downstream where the boulders created a shallow pool. They sat together on a large flat rock, the sun warming their backs, their bare feet cooling in the stream. "Remember bringing the kids here?" Martha asked. "Michael used to try to dam the whole river with rocks," Fred said with a chuckle. "Ellie just wanted to catch frogs. She still has that little ceramic frog she bought from the visitor center," Martha said, smiling at the memory. The afternoon passed gently. They ate their lunch, read from an old poetry book Fred kept in the glove box, and watched the water glitter and dance in the sun. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Fred put on a record, Waylon's warm voice filling the kitchen, and extended a hand to Martha. She laughed, as she always did, and stepped into his arms. They danced slowly, moving in a circle on the worn linoleum floor, the same way they had for decades. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the valley. It was just another ordinary day. But in the life they'd built together, ordinary days were the most precious of all. It began like any other morning. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias from the front flower beds, and dew clung to the grass like glass beads. Martha stood barefoot on the porch, a basket of laundry resting on her hip, watching as a hummingbird darted among the blossoms of the trumpet vine. She smiled softly, her white hair pulled back with a blue ribbon, her cotton dress fluttering gently in the breeze. Inside, Fred was humming under his breath, something Waylon, of course, as he rummaged through the cupboard for his favorite travel mug. They were planning a trip that morning to Silver Mine State Park, a favorite spot for both of them. Fred had packed a pair of old walking sticks and a small thermos of sweet tea, while Martha had made peanut butter and honey sandwiches and wrapped slices of peach pie in wax paper. "Don't forget your hat," Martha called through the screen door, hearing him clatter about in the kitchen. "I never forget my hat," Fred replied with a chuckle. "It's my head that forgets me." She laughed, a gentle, familiar sound that had comforted Fred for more than 5 decades. But that trip never came. It happened quickly. So quickly it seemed unreal, like something that had slipped in from someone else's story. One moment Fred was reaching for his mug, and the next he was on the floor, his body heavy, his breathing shallow. Martha's world narrowed to a pinpoint. She rushed to him, her hands trembling as she called his name, again and again. She fumbled for the phone, called 911, her voice barely audible through the rising panic. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Sirens echoing up the valley, uniformed EMTs moving swiftly through her kitchen, voices she couldn't process speaking words she couldn't understand. And then stillness. The ambulance drove away with its lights off. Martha stood alone on the porch, the basket of laundry forgotten, a single sock falling to the ground. The day had brightened into full morning, birds still chirping, the breeze still warm and fragrant. But the world felt colorless, soundless, broken in half. She wandered back inside and sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Fred's coffee mug still sat beside the newspaper, his glasses left askew on top of the crossword puzzle he'd half finished. Waylon's voice still drifted from the old record player, now scratching faintly at the end of the vinyl. She didn't cry, not at first. She couldn't. It was as though her body had turned to stone. The house, once filled with warmth, laughter, and familiar rituals, felt too large. Too quiet. A clock ticked. A faucet dripped. And Fred's absence echoed louder than either. The children arrived the next morning, flying in from opposite coasts, arms full of casseroles and sorrow. Michael stood tall and quiet, his strong jaw clenched as he hugged his mother, his graying hair damp from the rain. Ellie was softer, tearful, her blue eyes, so like Martha's, red-rimmed as she knelt by her mother's chair. They stayed for a week. They cleaned the house, answered phone calls, arranged the funeral. The church in Ironton was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, old co-workers, friends who had known Fred since he was a boy. Pastor Jim spoke gently of love and legacy, and of the kindness that had defined Fred Dawson's life. Martha sat in the front pew, her hands wrapped tightly around a handkerchief Fred had always kept in his pocket. She hadn't known she'd kept it, had found it in the laundry basket days after he passed, still warm with the scent of cedar and aftershave. After the funeral, people came to the house with pies and flowers, offering hugs and whispered condolences. But then, as always happens, they trickled away. Life for them returned to its rhythm. For Martha, it didn't. She spent her days wandering from room to room, dusting already clean surfaces, staring out the window, watching for a car that would never return. She tried to keep busy, tending the garden, washing the linens, folding and unfolding Fred's flannel shirts, but there was an aching hollowness to everything. Michael and Ellie noticed. "Mom," Ellie said gently one morning over coffee, "you don't have to be alone all the time." "I know, sweetheart," Martha replied, stirring cream into her cup with a distant expression. I don't know what to do without him." Michael exchanged a look with his sister. "We've been talking," he said carefully, "and we think maybe you could use some company." "Company?" Martha blinked. "Something to take care of," Ellie said. "Someone to keep you on your toes." That afternoon, they drove to a small farm just outside of Farmington, where a litter of chocolate Labrador puppies had just turned 8 weeks old. The barn smelled of hay and earth, and the sound of yipping greeted them as they stepped into the warm, straw-covered room. Martha hesitated, her fingers curling over her purse strap. But then a small brown bundle with big eyes and oversized paws waddled up to her, tilted his head, and let out a tiny, curious bark. Their eyes met, and something in Martha's chest shifted. "He chose you," the farmer said with a smile. Martha knelt down and picked the puppy up, cradling him against her chest. He squirmed for a moment and then settled, resting his head in the crook of her arm. "What's his name?" she asked softly. "He doesn't have one yet." Martha looked down at him, studying his eyes, deep, intelligent, warm with something she couldn't explain. A feeling that tugged at something deep in her memory. "I think I'll call him Darwin," she said. "He looks like a Darwin." And just like that, the stillness in her life was pierced. Not gone, but changed. She took Darwin home that evening. And though the house still felt too big, and the silence still lingered like fog, there was a new heartbeat in the halls now. A new set of paws on the floor. A new warmth curled beside her on the couch. And for the first time in weeks, as she watched Darwin snore softly by the fireplace, Martha smiled. The house felt different now. Not empty exactly, but not the same. Martha woke earlier than usual that morning, stirred not by the rooster, but by the soft patting of paws across the hardwood floor. Darwin, still a puppy with oversized feet and ears too big for his head, stood at the edge of her bed with his tail swishing in quiet excitement. She blinked through the gray morning light and smiled. "Well, good morning to you too." Darwin gave a soft bark and then licked her hand, impatient for breakfast or company or both. The days since Fred's passing had stretched like fog, quiet and indistinct. But with Darwin in the house, there was motion again. Purpose. Even if it was just chasing a sock down the hallway or cleaning up shredded bits of yesterday's newspaper. Martha dressed slowly in a soft green cardigan and gray slacks, her fingers lingering for a moment on the familiar row of porcelain animal figurines lined up on her dresser. Fred had bought her the tiny fox in the middle one Valentine's Day, many years ago. She picked it up, gave it a gentle kiss on the head, and placed it back beside the others. In the kitchen, Darwin nosed his food bowl across the floor impatiently. All right. You'd think you hadn't eaten in a week," she said, chuckling as she filled the bowl and poured herself a cup of tea. Outside, the early October morning was crisp and bright. The leaves had begun to turn, flames of gold and red flickering in the maple trees lining their property. The front porch was scattered with a few fallen leaves, and the scent of pine and distant wood smoke drifted on the breeze. Martha bundled up and clipped a red leash to Darwin's collar. He bounded down the steps, tugging eagerly toward the yard, then stopped to sniff every single leaf, rock, and stick along the path to the garden. They didn't go far at first, just a slow stroll to the edge of the field behind the house, where Fred used to keep a small bench beneath the cedar trees. She sat down and pulled her shawl tighter as Darwin curled up at her feet. From that little hill, she could see the valley unfold, Arcadia's sleepy rooftops, the gentle curve of Highway 21, and beyond that, the faint ridges of Taumsock Mountain on the horizon. A hawk circled above, silent and slow, as if watching over the land with reverence. "I used to come out here with your daddy," she said softly to Darwin. "We'd sit here and talk about the day or nothing at all. He'd hum that old Whalen song, you know the one." Darwin looked up with curious brown eyes and licked her hand. She leaned back on the bench and let the memory carry her for a moment. The warmth of Fred's arm around her shoulder. The sound of his laugh echoing over the hills. The way he'd tap his fingers against his knee, keeping time with a tune only he could hear. The wind rustled the cedar branches above her. For a moment, it felt like Fred was there. Later that afternoon, Martha packed a small bag with water, a few snacks, and a folded blanket. She loaded Darwin into the car, a task that required bribery and 2 failed attempts, and drove east past Ironton, through the winding roads that cut through the trees toward Silvermine State Park. It had been one of Fred's favorite places. Less crowded than the shut-ins, more rugged than Elephant Rocks. The Black River flowed like a ribbon of onyx between the steep banks, its currents carving through granite and thyme. Silver Mines had always felt like a secret between them. Martha parked near the old trailhead and clipped Darwin's leash again. The air here was cleaner, sharper. Birds chattered in the canopy above, and fallen leaves crunched beneath her boots as they followed the narrow trail toward the river. The trail was quiet, save for the gurgle of water and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. Darwin darted ahead, stopping every few feet to sniff or turn back to make sure she was still following. As they reached the overlook, a rocky ledge that jutted out above the water, Martha spread the blanket and sat, breath rising in small clouds around her. Below, the river glistened in the afternoon light. She remembered the last time she and Fred had come here. He'd sat on this very spot playing his harmonica, a low, meandering tune that blended with the flow of the river like they were speaking the same language. "I wish you could have seen him," she said to Darwin. "He loved this place. Said it made him feel young again." Darwin pressed close to her side, his body warm and solid against the crispness of the air. Martha ran her fingers through his soft fur and closed her eyes. Maybe it was the sound of the water, or the hush of the forest, or just her heart, still raw and remembering. But for the first time since Fred's passing, she didn't feel quite so alone. The days that followed settled into a rhythm both strange and comforting. Fred's absence still lingered like a shadow in every corner of the house. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the quiet record player, the porch swing that now only held one. But Darwin, with his clumsy paws and boundless affection, filled some of the hollow spaces with new energy. His presence was like a candle flickering in the dark, not bright enough to chase away all the grief, but steady enough to guide her through it. Each morning, Martha would dress in soft layers, often wrapping one of Fred's old scarves around her neck, and take Darwin for a walk down the gravel road behind the farmhouse. The early air carried the earthy perfume of pine and cedar, and the sounds of the valley waking up, the distant lowing of cattle, the rhythmic beat of a woodpecker, gave her something to focus on besides her aching heart. Darwin loved these walks. He charged ahead with excitement, tail wagging like a metronome, then circled back to check on Martha, as if to say, "You're doing good, keep going." One golden afternoon, Martha decided to take Darwin to Elephant Rocks State Park. She hadn't been there since before Fred passed, but something in her heart nudged her there that day. Maybe it was the way the sun broke through the clouds or the quiet restlessness that had settled in her bones. The massive granite boulders rose like sleeping giants from the earth, ancient, cracked, and dusted with lichen. They stood quietly in the forest, guardians of stories far older than anyone remembered. Darwin sniffed around the base of one enormous boulder, his tail twitching with curiosity. Martha reached out and placed a hand on the warm, sun-drenched rock. "Fred always loved this spot," she murmured. Said it made him feel small in a good way. She found her way to the short loop trail that wound through the boulders and the surrounding trees. The autumn air was brisk but not cold, and the leaves fluttered down like confetti, carpeting the trail in shades of crimson and gold. Darwin trotted beside her, sometimes leaping playfully through the piles of leaves, his joy infectious. As they walked, memories surfaced, Fred helping her climb atop one of the smaller rocks, pretending to be explorers. The way he'd pack trail mix in an old tin and sneak her chocolate pieces when no one was looking. Martha let the memories come. She didn't push them away like she had in those first hard days. Instead, she carried them with her, letting them walk beside her like an old friend. Later in the week, she drove a little farther, this time to Taumsauk Mountain. Darwin sat up in the passenger seat, ears perked and nose pressed to the cracked window, his breath fogging the glass. The trail to Sauk Falls was quiet that day, the forest hushed under a canopy of fading orange. They walked slowly, the path winding along the ridge. The distant hum of wind through the trees was like a lullaby, and the occasional chipmunk darted across the trail, keeping Darwin entertained. When they reached the overlook, Martha stopped and let out a soft breath. The view stretched for miles, hills folded upon hills, draped in the colors of fading summer. The waterfall trickled gently over the rocks below, its voice quiet but persistent, like the memories that still echoed in her soul. She sat on a bench carved from an old log, Darwin curling at her feet. She pulled out a small thermos of tea and one of Fred's old trail journals. He had always carried it on hikes, jotting down what birds they saw or sketching a funny-looking tree. She opened the journal and smiled. October 12th, saw a red fox. Martha says I'm more stubborn than one. She's probably right. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they didn't fall from a place of sorrow. They were warm, grateful. She held the journal to her chest and looked out across the valley. I miss you, Fred, she whispered. But I'm still walking. Darwin stirred and placed his head on her knee. They sat there together, surrounded by the peace of the hills, the steady rhythm of falling water, and the whisper of wind in the trees, a place where grief softened and healing began. It was a Thursday morning when the phone rang, its old-fashioned jangle echoing through the quiet farmhouse. Martha set down her knitting and picked up the receiver, cradling it against her shoulder. Hi, Mom. The voice was unmistakable, warm and steady, like the man who had once followed Fred around the backyard with a toy hammer, eager to help. It was Michael. Well, good morning, Martha replied, her smile already reaching her voice. This is a surprise. I was thinking, it's been too long. Ellie and I were talking last night. We thought we might both come visit next weekend. Bring the kids. Martha blinked back the unexpected tears that stung her eyes. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. When she hung up the phone, Darwin looked up from his spot by the stove, his tail giving a hopeful thump. We better clean the house, boy, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We've got company coming. By Saturday morning, the house was filled with a kind of energy it hadn't known in months. Laughter spilled down the hall, and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon rolls and sausage gravy. Michael had arrived the night before, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he hugged his mother tightly. His hair had gone mostly silver, but his eyes were still that same quiet gray. His wife, Janine, followed with a tray of muffins and a warm smile, and their sons, Daniel and Cole, tall, polite young men now, came in carrying their grandpa's old suitcases from the attic at Martha's request. Ellie arrived just after lunch with her twin girls, Grace and Lily, who ran through the house barefoot, giggling and trailing yarn from one of Martha's knitting baskets. Ellie looked so much like Martha had at her age, soft-featured and elegant, with a gentle laugh that brightened the room. Darwin was the star of the show. The grandkids took turns playing fetch with him in the backyard, and he patiently allowed Grace to place a daisy crown on his head while Lily fed him bits of bacon under the table. That evening, they all sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. Michael tuned Fred's old guitar and strummed a few chords. Ellie sang softly, her voice light and clear as birdsong. Martha sat in Fred's old rocker, her hands wrapped around a glass of sweet tea, watching her family together. The ache in her chest was still there. It might always be, but tonight it was softened by gratitude. They hadn't been together like this in years. The laughter, the familiar voices, the simple joy of being surrounded by the people she loved. It filled the spaces Fred had left behind with something warm and real. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Martha stepped outside again, Darwin at her side. The stars glittered above like tiny lanterns, and the air smelled of lilac and turned earth. She sat on the porch swing, pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and looked out across the valley. You'd love this, Fred, she whispered. You always said our kids would come back when we needed them. Darwin rested his head on her knee. And in that moment, surrounded by stars and the faint echo of laughter still clinging to the night, Martha felt something shift. A small but certain sense that she was going to be okay. The first signs of spring arrived in Arcadia Valley like a whispered promise. Pale green buds peeked from the branches of the redbuds and dogwoods, and the air carried the earthy scent of thawing soil. For Martha, spring had always been her favorite season, the time when life, after lying quiet and still, began to stretch and yawn and awaken. This spring, though, was different. It had been nearly 5 months since Fred's passing, and while the pain had dulled to a manageable ache, the silence in the house still pressed against her like a cold draft. But there was Darwin, always Darwin. Now 6 months old, the chocolate lab had grown fast, his lanky puppy limbs starting to give way to a sturdy frame. His coat gleamed rich and smooth in the morning light, and his amber eyes were bright and watchful. That morning, Martha stood on the porch in her garden gloves, a trowel in one hand and a ceramic pot in the other. Her pale blue cardigan was dusted with soil, and her white hair was tied up in a bright yellow kerchief that once belonged to her mother. Darwin watched her intently from the steps, tail sweeping across the wood with anticipation. "Well, come on then," she said, smiling. "You're not just going to sit there and supervise, are you?" The garden, long neglected since Fred's death, had begun to stir under Martha's care again. The marigolds were back, fiery orange and gold. The mint was creeping fast along the brick border. She had planted daffodils under the maple tree and new rows of tomatoes in the side patch. Gardening had always been her therapy, a gentle, healing ritual where hands and heart worked together. Darwin padded behind her as she knelt in the soil, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the overturned dirt. Every once in a while, he'd sit beside her, head tilted, almost like he was listening to the stories she whispered while planting. "Fred never did like weeding," she said softly, tugging a stubborn root. "He used to sneak off to the porch with a glass of lemonade the second I bent down to work." Darwin let out a low, soft huff that sounded suspiciously like amusement. Martha blinked at him. "You know," she murmured, studying his face, "sometimes I think you understand more than you let on." The dog merely wagged his tail, then trotted off to the edge of the yard where a squirrel had dared to chatter from the fence. That afternoon, they took a walk through Elephant Rock State Park. It had been Fred's favorite, massive ancient granite boulders rising like prehistoric sentinels from the earth. The sun filtered through the pines as Martha followed the Braille Trail loop, her cane tapping lightly along the ground. Darwin led the way, pausing every so often to glance back, as if making sure she was keeping up. At the top of one ridge, they paused. The rocks around them were warm and solid, and the view stretched all the way to Shepherd Mountain. The wind stirred Martha's scarf and carried with it the scent of cedar and wild moss. She sat on a bench nestled between two boulders and pulled out her journal. Darwin lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded in the sun. "I still feel him," she wrote slowly. "Sometimes in the mornings when I wake, I reach across the bed before I remember. Sometimes when the wind moves through the trees, I swear I hear him humming. And sometimes I look at Darwin and I know." She stopped, closed the book, and looked out over the valley. "I'm not ready to say it out loud," she whispered. "But I think you're still here, Fred. I think you found your way back to me." Darwin stirred slightly, pressing his head against her foot. They sat like that for a long time, surrounded by ancient stone and springtime winds, the silence between them full of love and memory. The calendar flipped to summer with the sound of cicadas in the trees and the sweet scent of blooming honeysuckle thick in the air. Arcadia Valley shimmered beneath long daylight hours, golden meadows, full creeks, and lazy afternoons. Martha's garden burst into life, the tomatoes fat on the vine and the lavender buzzing with bees. But it was Darwin who made the summer days special. Now nearly a year old, the chocolate lab was strong and graceful. His sleek coat caught the light like polished mahogany, and his amber eyes had deepened to something almost human. There was an intelligence in them that Martha couldn't explain, and a gentleness that struck her every time he rested his head on her lap or tilted his head just so when she spoke. One humid afternoon in July, Martha was in the kitchen kneading dough for a blackberry cobbler. She hummed a Waylon Jennings tune as she worked, her hands coated in flour. Darwin lay nearby on the braided rug, his eyes watching her every move. "Don't give me that look," she said, tossing him a scrap of dough. "You're not fooling anyone, mister." He didn't eat the dough. Instead, he padded over to the old radio sitting on the shelf near the window. With his nose, he nudged the dial, something she had never taught him to do. The radio clicked on, and out came the voice of Waylon himself, low and twangy, singing "Dreaming My Dreams with You." Martha froze, her heart thudding against her ribs. She dropped the dough, her hands suddenly trembling. Darwin sat back on his haunches, ears perked, tail still. "Fred," she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to the past or the present. The music filled the space around her, haunting and familiar. Slowly, she moved to the kitchen chair and sat down hard, staring at the dog who was now watching her with calm, knowing eyes. "Fred, if you can hear me," she murmured, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I miss you every single day." Darwin walked over and pressed his head into her lap. She stroked his ears gently, closing her eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, it was as though a warm, familiar hand was holding hers again. Later that week, she took him to Silvermine State Park, just outside of Fredericktown. It was a place Fred had always loved for the solitude and the sound of the Black River tumbling over the old stones. They hiked the trail along the ridge, Darwin trotting ahead, but always doubling back to check on her. When they reached a clearing that overlooked the river's bend, she sat down on a boulder, breathing in the scent of damp pine and river rock. She pulled a photo from her pocket, one of Fred in his younger years, smiling beside their old blue truck. Darwin climbed onto the rock beside her, his body warm against hers. "Do you remember this place?" she asked aloud, not really expecting an answer. "You used to bring me here when the world got too noisy. Said the river could drown out everything but love." Darwin let out a low, soft sigh, then nudged the photo gently with his nose. Martha blinked. "You really do know, don't you?" The sun dipped behind the trees, and the forest turned golden green, the air thick with memory and magic. For the first time in many months, she wasn't just smiling because Darwin made her feel less alone. She was smiling because she knew. Knew in her bones. In her soul. Fred was still with her. Maybe not in the way she expected. But he hadn't gone far. As they walked back to the car, Martha looked up at the sky, painted with streaks of lavender and coral. "I love you," she whispered. Darwin barked once, sharp and clear. She smiled. "I know, sweetheart. I know." Martha sat on the porch swing, wrapped in her favorite quilt, the one Fred's mother had made so many years ago. The early spring air was brisk, but carried with it the scent of lilac and damp earth. Darwin sat at her feet, now a large and handsome chocolate lab, his muzzle beginning to show a touch of gray. A year had passed since the day she brought him home. In that time, Darwin had become not just her companion, but a comforting presence, one that seemed too knowing, too familiar. He tilted his head and looked up at her, as though reading her thoughts. "You miss him too, don't you?" she whispered, running her fingers through the soft fur between his ears. Darwin gave a soft whine and rested his chin on her knee. Lately there had been moments that caught her off guard. The way he waited for her by the door at the exact time Fred always used to come home from work. The way he tilted his head at her favorite songs, especially when Waylon Jennings played on the record player. He would sit, perfectly still, eyes half closed, as though listening with reverence. And then there were the dreams. She'd begun to have them more frequently. Dreams where Fred would appear, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as he was in their youth. Smiling, strong, alive. Always standing near Darwin. Sometimes touching him gently on the head. Sometimes watching quietly from a distance. Martha had never been one to believe in the mystical. But grief has a way of shifting your boundaries, softening the edges of what's possible. She rose from the swing and stepped into the yard, Darwin rising with her. The wind picked up slightly, and the chimes on the porch began to sing a gentle tune. They walked side by side past the flower beds, down the gravel path toward the edge of the woods. Spring was waking everything up. Tiny green buds peeked from the branches. Cardinals called to one another from the treetops. The trail behind the house led down to a small creek, its banks lined with mossy stones. Fred had once carved their initials into the bark of an old sycamore there. Martha paused by that tree, running her fingers over the weathered carving. F+M. Darwin sniffed around the base of the tree before sitting and looking up at her. There was something in his gaze, steady, warm, familiar. "Sometimes I think you're trying to tell me something," she said softly. "Something I haven't quite figured out yet." Darwin didn't move, just held her gaze. That night, after she brushed her hair and slipped into bed, Darwin curled up beside her on the floor. She reached over and turned off the lamp. The room fell into a comfortable darkness. "Good night, Fred," she whispered, half asleep. She froze. The name had slipped out so naturally. Darwin stirred, then let out a content sigh. Martha's heart beat a little faster, but she smiled to herself, tears stinging her eyes. "I miss you," she murmured. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. The house settled. The stars stretched in silence over Arcadia Valley. And in the hush of that sacred space, surrounded by memories and love, something unseen stirred, something eternal. Whether in dreams or the gentle eyes of a dog who seemed to understand too much, Fred was still there. Watching. Guarding. Loving. Always. The wind that swept across Arcadia Valley that morning had the bite of late autumn. The leaves, once vibrant with reds and golds, now carpeted the ground in rustling piles. Martha pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped outside, Darwin trailing behind her like a shadow. The days had grown shorter. The sun rose slower and set faster, as if the earth itself was winding down. Martha felt it, too, in her joints, in her breath, in her bones. Still, she tried to keep up her routines. The garden needed tending. The porch needed sweeping. The world didn't stop just because you were tired. "Come on, boy," she said, her voice light despite the chill. "Let's get some fresh air." Darwin padded beside her as they walked the familiar path behind the house, down to the creek where Fred had once carved their initials into the sycamore. They visited this spot often. It was a sacred place now. She paused and touched the bark with her fingertips. A gust of wind blew through the trees, stirring the fallen leaves in a golden swirl. Darwin looked up suddenly, his ears pricked, his body tense. "What is it?" Martha asked gently. He let out a low whine, nudging her hand with his nose. "I'm fine," she said with a smile. "Just a little tired, that's all." But she wasn't fine. Later that afternoon, as she stood on the step stool in the kitchen trying to reach a jar on the top shelf of the pantry, the world shifted. Her balance gave way. The stool wobbled, and she fell. The sound of her body hitting the floor echoed through the farmhouse. Plates clattered. Darwin barked, sharp, panicked. He was at her side in seconds, licking her face, whining, pawing gently at her unmoving hand. Martha moaned. The pain radiated from her hip like fire. She tried to sit up but couldn't. Darwin barked again, running to the front door, then back to her, back and forth in a frantic dance. She reached up and touched his face, her voice thin. "It's okay, boy. I just need a little time." But it wasn't okay. The hours passed slowly. Martha drifted in and out of consciousness on the kitchen floor, the cold creeping into her bones. Darwin lay beside her, pressing his body close, trying to keep her warm. When the phone rang, she couldn't reach it. When night fell, the darkness settled in. It was morning when Ellie finally called again, and getting no answer, sent the sheriff to check on her mother. They found her curled on the floor, Darwin still at her side, his eyes alert, as if he'd been standing guard all night. At the hospital in Farmington, the doctors confirmed what Martha already knew deep down. Her hip was fractured. Surgery was necessary. Recovery would be slow and difficult, especially at her age. And things would never be quite the same. Michael and Ellie flew in within a day. They sat beside her hospital bed, their eyes filled with worry and guilt. Darwin stayed with Michael at the farmhouse, but he whimpered at the door each night, waiting for someone who wasn't coming home just yet. "I told you not to climb on things," Ellie whispered, brushing her mother's hair back. Martha offered a faint smile. "It was just a jar of preserves. Fred used to get it for me." Michael squeezed her hand gently. "We're going to take care of everything, Mom. Don't you worry." But she did worry. She wasn't afraid of pain or even of dying, not really. What frightened her was the idea of not returning to the house she had lived in for over 50 years. The thought of leaving behind the porch swing, the flower beds, the shelf of trinkets, the trail to the sycamore. And Darwin. She missed him more than she expected. The hospital bed was cold without his warmth nearby. The nights were lonelier. On the third evening, she had another dream. Fred stood at the edge of a sunlit field, the golden grasses waving around him. He looked exactly like he did the day they met, broad shoulders, hazel eyes shining with mischief, arms outstretched. "Come on, darling," he said, smiling. "Just a little farther." She took a step toward him, but then awoke, the white hospital ceiling above her, the 4 drips softly ticking. Tears slid down her cheeks. She didn't want to say goodbye. Not yet. The wheelchair squeaked softly as Michael guided it up the ramp they'd installed on the front porch of the farmhouse. It had been 3 weeks since the surgery, and though Martha's recovery was slow, the doctors agreed she was well enough to return home, if someone stayed with her. Michael had taken leave from work, promising to be there for as long as she needed. Martha's breath caught when they rolled onto the porch. The scent of the late autumn breeze, the distant lowing of cows in the hills, the familiar creak of the swing swaying in the wind. It all wrapped around her like a long-lost embrace. Darwin was already at the door, tail wagging so hard it smacked against the frame. The moment Michael opened it, the chocolate lab bounded out, nearly toppling them both as he licked Martha's hands, her face, her arms, every part of her he could reach. "Oh, Darwin," she whispered, her voice catching. "I missed you too, sweetheart." His body pressed into hers, his soft whine more like a cry, and his soulful eyes were shimmering with something deeper than joy. It was as if he understood everything, as if he'd been waiting for this very moment. Michael gently knelt beside the pair, watching the reunion unfold. "I think he's missed you more than we realized." Darwin curled up beside Martha's chair and wouldn't move for the rest of the afternoon. The farmhouse, while still beautiful, bore the hush of long absence. Dust had settled in the corners, and the flower beds had browned with the first frost. Michael took to tidying up with the quiet efficiency of a man needing something to do, while Martha eased back into her space like slipping on a well-worn sweater. With Michael there to help, life settled into a gentler rhythm. He made strong coffee in the mornings and played the radio low, just like his father had. He fixed creaky doors and replaced the cracked panes in the greenhouse, chatting softly with Martha as he worked. They reminisced about childhood memories, about fishing at Lake Killarney, Christmas mornings, and long hikes through Elephant Rocks where Michael once broke his arm climbing a boulder. "Dad carried me the whole mile back," Michael said one morning, looking out over the frosted fields. "Didn't complain once." "That's the kind of man he was," Martha replied, her voice thick with emotion. Sometimes, when Michael was outside working or in town for errands, Martha would sit in her recliner and Darwin would rest his head in her lap. She'd run her fingers through his thick fur and talk softly to him. "I think I'm not as afraid of leaving anymore," she said one evening, watching the orange light fade through the window. "It's not because I'm ready, but because I know you'll be there when the time comes. Just like Fred always was." Darwin looked up, and for a fleeting moment, his gaze was so deeply human it made her breath catch. One night, as the wind howled through the valley and the fireplace crackled low, Martha awoke with a start. Darwin was sitting at the foot of her bed, staring at her with quiet intensity. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice hoarse. He didn't move. She sat up, wincing from the stiffness in her hip, and reached out to him. He leaned into her touch. "Fred," she whispered, barely able to say it aloud. The name hung in the air, trembled in the silence. Darwin blinked slowly, then turned and padded out of the room, stopping just beyond the doorway. He looked back as if beckoning her to follow. Trembling, Martha rose, slipped on her robe, and followed him down the hallway. He led her to the living room, where the old record player sat beside the shelf of vinyls. Darwin nudged the cabinet door open with his nose. Martha stared in disbelief. Inside, already loaded onto the turntable, was Fred's favorite Waylon Jennings album, Dreaming My Dreams. She had not put it there, and Michael certainly hadn't. Darwin sat back and looked up at her, ears lifted, head tilted slightly. With shaking hands, she turned the knob. The soft crackle of needle-meeting vinyl filled the room, followed by Waylon's voice, warm and full of longing. "I may never see you again. I might be a drifter till the end." Tears welled in her eyes. Martha crossed to the armchair and sank into it. Darwin climbed into her lap like he had as a pup, his body heavy and warm. She clutched him close and cried into his fur, cried for her loss, for her fear, for the impossible beauty of this moment. She didn't understand how, but she knew. Fred was here. Somehow. The days passed softly after the night of the record player, each one stitched together with a quietness that felt sacred. Martha said nothing to Michael about what had happened. Some truths were meant to live between souls, unspoken but undeniable. Darwin stayed close to her now, closer than ever before. He no longer bounded around the farmhouse like a playful pup, though he still had bursts of energy when the grandchildren called, or when a rabbit dared to dash through the garden. But more and more he moved with calm purpose. Watching. Waiting. As if guarding something precious. Michael began to notice things too. "I swear, Mom," he said one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea, "that dog looks at you like he knows everything you're thinking." Martha smiled faintly and kept folding laundry. "Maybe he does." There was no disbelief in her voice anymore. No skepticism. Only acceptance. That evening, when the air was touched with the chill of oncoming winter, Martha and Michael sat bundled on the porch swing. The stars were bright over the Arcadia Valley, the Milky Way spilling like a river across the sky. Darwin lay at Martha's feet, ears perked toward the rustle of leaves. "You doing okay, Mom?" Michael asked gently. She looked out over the fields, where the frost silvered the tall grass. I am. I wasn't, but I am now. Michael looked at her, puzzled. There are things we can't explain, sweetheart, she said softly. But that doesn't mean they aren't true. He didn't press. He only nodded, trusting her the way a son trusts the quiet wisdom of his mother. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the fields and hills in soft white. Icicles hung from the porch roof like crystal teeth, and the trees at Elephant Rocks stood quiet and bare, their granite silhouettes like forgotten monuments under the gray sky. Martha moved slowly now. Her steps were shorter, her breath caught more often. Her hip ached constantly, and there were days when she could hardly rise from her chair without help. But her spirit remained warm. She kept her tea warm on the stove and still trimmed the houseplants in the windowsill. She read poetry aloud to Darwin and sometimes hummed Wayland songs while gazing out at the snowy landscape. Darwin never left her side. He slept at her feet, walked beside her on careful strolls to the mailbox, and curled up on the rug beside her bath in the evenings. His eyes never left her. Not once. And every now and then, when the wind howled just right through the trees and the sky turned a particular shade of violet at dusk, Martha would whisper, "I know it's you, Fred." And Darwin would lift his head, blink slowly, and press his warm nose into her hand. One morning, just before Christmas, Ellie arrived from North Carolina. Her arms were full of wrapped gifts, and her daughters came trailing behind her like little whirlwinds of laughter. Ellie had Martha's eyes, soft and observant. She hugged her mother tightly and didn't let go for a long time. "You look tired, Mama," she said. "I'm just old, sweetheart." "Don't worry," Martha replied, brushing a loose strand of hair from Ellie's cheek. "I'm surrounded by love." That evening, as the fire crackled and the girls played with their dolls, Ellie sat on the edge of the couch and looked at Darwin. He was lying near the hearth, his chin resting on his paws, watching Martha intently. "He doesn't act like a dog," she said quietly. Martha smiled. "No, he doesn't." "You think?" Ellie hesitated. "Do you think he's something more?" Martha didn't answer immediately. She reached for her cup of tea, took a slow sip, then turned her gaze toward Darwin. "I think love finds its way back to us," she said softly, "in whatever form it needs to." That night, while the snow drifted quietly against the windows and the farmhouse settled into sleep, Darwin stood at the foot of Martha's bed once more. She opened her eyes and smiled. "You're waiting again." He patted forward and gently placed something on the quilt. It was Fred's old watch. It hadn't been seen in years, not since the week after the funeral. They thought it had been lost. Martha's fingers trembled as she picked it up. The hands were still frozen at the time of his passing. She looked at Darwin, and the tears came not with sorrow, but with overwhelming peace. "It's almost time, isn't it?" she whispered. Darwin pressed his head gently into her hand. She leaned back against her pillow, holding the watch to her chest. Her breaths grew slower, more shallow. Outside, the wind moved through the valley like a lullaby. And Darwin, faithful and full of something deeper than devotion, laid down beside her, resting his head across her chest, as if to listen to the last beats of a shared heart. The funeral was over. The mourners had gone home, the casserole dishes had been wrapped in foil, and the quiet had returned to the little white farmhouse at the edge of Arcadia Valley. A gentle frost silvered the ground. Inside, the house was still. The heart of it, Martha, was gone. Darwin lay on the porch where he had waited for her each evening since she'd fallen ill. But this time, she didn't return. Michael and Ellie packed what they could. The house felt hollow without her, like a music box with no melody. They agreed to take Darwin back with them. He was old now, graying around the muzzle, moving slower with each passing day. He would be cared for, loved. But when they looked for him the next morning, Darwin was gone. It was Ellie who found him hours later. She followed the light prints in the frost past the edge of the property, down the trail toward the small country cemetery where Martha had been laid to rest beside Fred. There, under the old sycamore tree, she spotted him. Darwin was curled up at the foot of the grave. In his mouth was an old, worn slipper, Martha's favorite, the one that still held a trace of her scent. And as Ellie approached, something stopped her. A weight in the air. A presence. Darwin lifted his head slowly, and for the briefest moment, Ellie saw something flicker in his dark, soulful eyes. Something too familiar, too human. A glint of mischief. Of devotion. It was her father's gaze. Her breath caught. Her heart squeezed. And then she knew. He hadn't just watched over Martha. He had come back for her. Epilogue rewritten. The other side of the mist. The sun rose over Arcadia Valley, casting gold across the hills and rivers like paint brushed by the hand of heaven. Morning mist gathered at the base of the mountains and drifted low across the ground, wrapping the land in gentle silence. Somewhere beyond that veil, on the other side of this life, a path curved through wildflowers and tall grass. And on that path, Fred stood waiting. He looked just as he had when Martha first fell in love with him. Tall, strong, his hazel eyes sparkling with the same boyish charm. A flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves. A sprig of mint tucked behind one ear. When Martha appeared through the mist, she paused. She blinked once. Then again. "Fred," she said, her voice trembling. He smiled softly. "Took me long enough, didn't it?" Her hand flew to her mouth. "It was you all this time." "I couldn't leave you alone," he said, stepping closer. "Not like that. So I came back the only way I could. As that scruffy, four-legged old rascal." Martha let out a laugh that turned into a sob. "Darwin. You were Darwin." Fred nodded. "I never left you, darlin'. I stayed by your side, just like I promised I would. Every morning. Every walk. Every tear." She rushed into his arms, and he held her tight, the way he always had. "I thought I was going crazy," she whispered into his chest. "But deep down I knew. I felt you in him." "You weren't crazy," Fred said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were loved." They stood there for a long time, holding each other beneath a sky lit with golden clouds, the scent of honeysuckle on the breeze. Then Fred took her hand. "Come on," he said. "We've got a whole eternity ahead of us. The porch swing's waitin'. The coffee's warm. And I've got Waylon queued up." Martha laughed through her tears, her fingers curling around his. Together, they walked into the mist, two souls entwined, hearts mended, love eternal. And as they faded into the morning light, the wind carried a whisper through the valley, a whisper only the wildflowers and birds seemed to hear. "Forever, my love."